Welcome. It's great to see so many of you out here. There's so many other distractions like Svalbard and excursions and the buffet and everything else. So I appreciate you coming out, and especially those of you who are watching on the live TV, and those who might be able to catch a little bit later as you get back late from your excursion. So I appreciate you being here. I think at the end of last talk, I sort of gave a bit of a teaser, and I said, I sort of started thinking about this topic when I was in a Costco just outside of Ottawa recently, and saw this in the frozen trays, the frozen sections there, this package of frozen Norwegian salmon. Canadians make a lot of salmon, both on the east and the west coast. Farm salmon on the east coast and primarily wild or captured salmon on the west coast. And I thought, why have we got Norwegian salmon in here when we can provide our own? Anybody experience the same thing? Have any of you seen Norwegian salmon in your hometowns? Who actually has seen Norwegian salmon in your hometowns? So they actually have a global reach, and I've got a couple slides here to show you the global reach of the Norwegian aquaculture, especially the salmon aquaculture industry. And so that, and you'll see that it's more than just sort of just another industry for Norway, and we'll see that as we go down the coast as well. And I should add as well, sort of preface this by saying that when you think of fishing in Norway or elsewhere, one convenient way to divide fishing is into the wild or captured side and the aquaculture or farm side. And so Penny and I are both having presentations on fishing related to Norway. And we decided to divvy it up in that I'm looking primarily at the aquaculture side, and Penny in a later presentation is looking primarily at the wild and captured side. So that's why you won't see as much. For me, I do a bit of comparison at the beginning, historical comparison, but you won't see very much in terms of the wild or captured fish side for Norway. So you can see based on this list of topics here, sort of a bit of what I'm going to do is sort of set this in context, especially sort of to start with this historical context about the role of aquaculture, and we tend to think of aquaculture by these sort of round pens. That's the ones you've seen already in here and elsewhere. But in fact, when you think historically and even currently in terms of aquaculture, that isn't the primary mode of farm fishing. And so we'll talk about that a little bit in terms of that historical context. And then we'll bring you up to date in terms of almost like how aquaculture started in Norway and what it really means now in terms of the big business for aquaculture in Norway, and not only in Norway itself, but how it's had that impact around the world. This slide I prepared partly for those people that started in New York and have gone right through, but I think even those people that started the trip in Reykjavik can realize that there's a theme in many of the places we've visited or will visit, and that theme is fish in some way, whether that's in the cuisine or whether it's in the culture and history of the communities. And some of these, just in terms of in my case, from New York on, look at what we've got here. I think my last presentation, I had an image of the Blue Nose schooner, the fishing schooner off of the coast of Nova Scotia and Lunenburg, and it's on the Canadian dime up here in the upper left-hand side here. The Faroes and their annual pilot seal hunt that exists there, and the importance of that, not necessarily as a meat, but as a way that they identify themselves, despite protests and opposition internationally. I use that slide at the bottom middle here, the fisheries protection zone off of mainland Norway and around Svalbard. In the upper right-hand corner here, you see an image for the collapse of the cod industry off of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, and how it virtually collapsed in about 1992, and the Canadian government had to put a moratorium, and it really has never recovered since that. And the bottom right, Iceland, I gave a presentation a little while ago about the Cod Wars and the battle between Britain and Iceland, and how the Icelandic Coast Guard used these creative ways of battling the trawlers by dragging almost like a set of metal hooks behind, and they cut the nets for the trawlers, and the trawlers then had to go back to Britain. So it's a theme in a lot of these North Atlantic places. So there's evidence of fishing, human fishing, for the past 70,000 years. And this is obviously, for much of that time, it's recreational. And we think of fishing, we all have memories, many of us have memories of fishing recreationally and how important that is for ourselves, for our households, and for our family. When we think of it, especially in terms of cod, it's been such a significant fish. This book that I've got, the cover jacket up here, by Mark Karlansky, if you get a chance to read it, it's a good read. It's not a huge tome. It's a very readable book, but it shows the importance of cod for the world as we know it today. There was a phrase that when I was looking at the Newfoundland cod fishery, that one of the fishermen said, I think it was exaggerating, but he said you could walk across the cod from the ship to the shore. It was so plentiful at one point. But this book by Karlansky was a wonderful book if you get it. And he also actually wrote a book prior to this, or after it, subsequent on, called Salt, the importance of salt as a historical commodity and how that changed societies and the economy. I was in Spain and I've been in Spain and Portugal in each of the last 2 years. In the grocery stores, you can still find, if you've been to Spain and Portugal in the grocery stores, you can still find the sides of salted, dried cod sitting there right in the fish in the butcher section. So let's look now at the global level of fishing, and especially as we distinguish it between that wild and captured side and the aquaculture or farm side. And I should say that there is another element to this that we can't forget, and that is that the raising and releasing of hatchlings, or whether it's salmon or trout, overlaps with that. It primarily overlaps with the wild or captured. So there are almost all fishing-dependent places have, including Norway and Canada, etc., have an enormous investment in the raising and then the release of hatchlings that go downriver or whatever, and then feed and grow to maturity and then come up to spawn or captured in the sea. And so there's strong links to the recreational industry as well as the commercial and capture fish industry. So although farm fishing has been around in Asia at least 4,000 years, for most of the 70,000 years that you can think of in terms of fishing, wild fishing has been much more significant than the aquaculture and farm fishing. This image only goes as far back as 1950, and you can see at that start of that graph on the left-hand side there was virtually no aquaculture to speak of, at least in terms of that global level. But by about 1950, if you start seeing this, and by about 1990, track that across, and you see that light blue and the dark blue, it levels off. So what that is telling you is that the global production of wild or captured fish is not really been growing significantly as measured by millions of tons for the last 70 years, 1950, 1960 on. And what has contributed to the growth has been the aquaculture, or farmed fishing. And in fact, this last year of this graph, 2022, if you look at it there, if you look closely, you realize that the purplish brownish part is finally actually greater than the blue part. So for the first time in 2022, in virtually the history of keeping records, we're actually producing and consuming more farmed aquaculture fish than we are wild or captured fish. And in fact, in 2022, there was 185 million tons globally of fish in total produced. 94.4 million of that was aquaculture, and 91 million was the wild or captured. And that gap, as you can imagine, is undoubtedly going to increase in the future years. So in the West, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, I think our image of aquaculture has been dominated by those round sea pens you see in the fjords or just on the inshore fishery. But as you can see from this caricature or diagram here, there are many ways in which aquaculture has and does continue to take place. So you have to move beyond what our perceptions are of those pens we see in the fjords. In fact, globally, those pens in the fjords are really not, it's very significant compared to the amount or the kinds of farm fish and the ways that fish are farmed. So you can see we do have those open water cages. Unfortunately, this doesn't have a pointer, but you can see the open water cages down here, the pens that we were talking about. But look at all the other ways. You can have the open water in fresh water, in ponds or lagoons. You can have the closed systems, and there are a lot of closed on-land systems of raising fish, where the water is pumped in from the nearby sea, and then the wastewater is pumped out. You can also have, I spent 14 years in Prince Edward Island in Canada, and they have a lot of the suspended mussel pods, where the water is filtered through the pods for mussels. And they also have a lot of the oyster beds that are where the cages are suspended just underneath. And you can see a lot of seaweed is also raised in that way. So there's an enormous industry, enormous number of ways in which aquaculture takes place, other than just that iconic image of the round pens. In 2020, 75% of the edible weight from inland freshwater aquaculture, or 75% was of the total aquaculture was from inland, so not the offshore. And most of that, 92% of that was from Asia. And from that amount, 60% of the total was China alone. So China is an incredibly large producer or producer of farmed fish. We don't hear about it very much because, at least in terms of the Chinese industry, most of it is consumed domestically. So you don't hear about it that much because it's not traded often on the international market. It's also very common in Asia to integrate the raising of fish in a paddy system, whether it's rice or something else. So they integrate that almost in a sort of a circular system. So carp have been raised for thousands of years, and they've taken on not only an economic significance, but they've taken on a cultural and even an artistic significance, as you can tell from this image of a carp, stylized carp in Japan. If you've ever traveled to Southeast Asia, you don't have to look very far to see the role that fish farming plays. It's not uncommon for rice farmers, to have their rice, raise their rice crop for 8 or 9 months, harvest it, and then irrigate that, flood the fields that had the rice, and start a 3-month sort of intensive carp or other farm fish kind of operation there. And so at the end of the 3 months, they harvest all of the fish, the carp, and so on. And the added benefit of that is that the waste from the carp actually adds nutrients to the soil and actually improves the crop of rice in the next harvest of rice. And so it's a very circular system. It works, and it's been practiced for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And my last comment explains this chart. If you look at those top 2 lines, in fact, look at even more lines than that. If you took at those top few horizontal lines, you realize that in 2020, China and India combined produce 66% of world aquaculture production by the volume of fish. And then look at some of the countries that are listed here: Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand. A lot of these are in the developing world or the global south. And so they have been an incredibly important element of animal protein and protein in general in many of those. And Norway, actually, despite its importance for export, and we'll get to a second, it only ranks 7th on this at only 1.7% of the global total of aquaculture production by volume in 2020. If you look at that chart down at the bottom left, you'll see that some countries, like Bangladesh, fish constitute the majority of animal protein that's consumed in the country. In the case of China and Norway, it's about 1/4 to 1/5, so that 20 to 25% of animal protein, it comes from fish. In the United States, I wanted to look up what the United States was, it's only 7%. So in fact, there may be room for a lot of growth in that industry in the United States and elsewhere in the developed world. So the other one point I want to make here is this just also reinforces not only the current, but potentially the future importance of aquaculture in many of the countries of the global south and the developing world. So if we look now, focus in on Norway in particular, the first evidence of aquaculture that we can probably see is associated with monasteries. And historically, what happened was the monasteries raised the carp for local production or local consumption in the monastery and the surrounding village there. And we know that must have been before the 1550s, because the monasteries were dissolved in 1556, 57 as part of the Protestant Reformation, when Catholic religious sites were dismantled in Norway. And so this is an image that shows the correlation between the location of monasteries in those red circles you can see, and the carp pools and lagoons that were found from archaeological work and other things. So you notice that there's a very strong correlation between the location of these. And it's not necessarily always near the coast. So there's a high correlation regardless of where the monasteries are. And then you start seeing more and more of them around church sites and chiefdoms from 1450 right through. And it expanded into the 18th century. And into the 18th century, you found these pools where they were raising fish on the noblemen's estates and the upper class as well. So they had their own sources of fish. And it wasn't until the 1850s that you started seeing the fish being produced and hatcheries for restocking of salmon and trout being created in Norway. In that period, now into the 1900s, the two main species of fish that were being raised are Atlantic salmon and rainbow trout. And it began in about the 1850s almost as a backyard business. We almost think of that now from a business perspective as somebody starting their business in their garage or in their little warehouse that they've created. So it was fishermen who actually decided to do this, and they were actually copying some of the techniques that were being used in Europe to raise trout. So that's why trout was actually a species that was one of the earliest aquaculture fish by fishermen in the inshore fjords. When they started selling it, they realized that they were producing so much that the domestic market was very quickly saturated. So they started selling throughout Europe. So this was the first time as well into the 50s and the 60s where the Norwegian aquaculture industry was starting to broaden out beyond Norway to elsewhere in Europe. Norway now exports more than 95% of its own production to more than 100 countries. And they introduced sea pens in about the 1970s. And production increased slowly so that by about 1980, they were producing about 8,000 metric tons. And they were about 50% salmon and about 50% trout at that time in the 1980s. Norway, remember, and we'll see this as we go down the coast of Norway, Norway has a heck of a lot of coastline. In fact, if you look at several sources, depending on how you measure it, Norway has the second most coastline of any country in the world. Does anyone know guess which has the most coastline? Canada has the most, but in fact, when you think of where the most of Canada's coastline is, it's up in the high north in the Arctic. And it's not a great place to put sea pens or try to practice aquaculture on a year-round basis. So in fact, even though Norway only has the second most, and by the way, it's second most by far, I think that 83,000, I think third, I can't remember, was Indonesia or whatever, had about 50,000. I know Sweden has a lot as well. But it's a heck of a lot of coastline in terms of protected coastline, given all those fjords. Now, as we'll see as we travel down the coast, fishing and aquaculture is important for many of the small communities that are in many of those fjords. Historically, in Norway, if you look back, there were 90,000 fishermen in 1900, and that's out of a population of about 2.2 million. And in 1939, so just prior to the Second World War, there was 120,000 fishermen out of 3 million people. So that's still a lot of fishermen, a high representation. So there's a culture and a history to fishing regardless of how it's done. This image in the top right here you see, this is for 2023, and it shows Norway is the largest exporter of fish. And that produces in the value of $15 billion US a year, at least in 2023. In the image in the bottom left, you can see where that fish is going. And perhaps surprisingly, the number one market is Poland. The second market here is, after Poland, is Denmark, and the third market is the United States for their fish. Now, I wanted to find out, well, how important is this for Norway in terms of all of its exports? And although it's still very important, just less than 10% here, you can see, it's dwarfed by the value of exports of oil and gas and other kinds of minerals. So 66% of Norway's exports by value are still fossil fuels. And my next talk is actually, not the next one, the one after that is, I'll talk a little bit more about this in terms of rural development on Norway. But still, despite the fact that this is only 9.2% of the total value of all exports in Norway, it's still the world's leading producer of Atlantic salmon and exporter. And employment in aquaculture in Norway in just 2023 was over 10,000 people, just 10,200. And 1.6 million tons were produced just a couple of years ago. Atlantic salmon, remember I had that figure about it being 50-50 between trout and salmon? In the most recent figures that I looked at, 95% is now salmon, and the remaining 5% is about trout. And almost all of that salmon is exported. So I just want to make one other point about the wild fishery, and I'll go back to the aquaculture here, because this is a diagram that shows the location of the aquaculture sites in Norway. Compared to the wild fishery, I think there are about 5,600 small-scale boats, fishing boats. This is less than 15 meters in length in Norway. And so they're very strongly connected to the communities. And so it's still, many of the communities still identify very much with the wild or captured fishery because of that long history of it. And they're also very different in scale. They're very small scale ownership of sort of an industry. The aquaculture industry, there are over 1,000 sites now along the coast of Norway. And it is a much larger scale. So in terms of the capital required to start these, in terms of the size of the effort, it's much larger than the wild or captured fishery in Norway. So there's about 1,000 of these, and they're expanding rapidly. And they're owned by about, I think the last I heard was about 165 companies owns those 1,000 plus pens. So even though there are 165, that 70% of the production actually comes from 10% of those companies. And that's not uncommon. So there's a bit of consolidation going on there, with 70% coming from only 16 or 15 or 16 of those companies. With this consolidation, you can imagine what's happening. It's increasing in scale and capital intensity with those larger companies. And I wanted to put this in so you could see the changes that have been taking place just in terms of the scale and the kinds of technology that is being used from the 1950s through to the 1960s to the 2000s, and this is sort of current in the 2020s. 1950s, look at the scale of those, and often the materials that were used were different for the pens as well. They often used wood to begin with, and then they shifted to use metal in some cases, and now almost universally it's plastic, and in some cases, as you'll see in the slide coming up, it's actually, sometimes you can see it's fully enclosed, but still within an inshore fishery. This is an image of the most recent versions of the pens. And so this, you can imagine the scale of this compared to some of those others, even the one at the far right of my previous one there. This would dwarf that. This is the Salmar companies, one of the large salmon producer companies. This is their Ocean Farm 1 being towed off the island of Frøya in central Norway. And this was built in 2017 in China and then shipped to, that must have been quite a sight to see. If you were in a cruise ship going past and you see this going in the opposite direction to you. It's almost 70 meters high or 75 yards high from bottom to top of the pen. And it's 110 meters or 120 yards in diameter across. It can produce 6,000 tons of salmon per year, and that's 1.5 million fish every 14 or 15 months. And so this is actually in operation right now. And there's an Ocean Farm 2 that is now being put into production with slightly large capacity than this. These things cost about equivalent to 200 million US each to produce and put in a site. These are supposedly unescapable, so fish can't escape from them. But there have already been a couple of incidents of escapes. I get the feeling that the fish are wearing white and black stripes as they get out of here. So the typical production of salmon in Norway is still the inshore pens in the fjords, and you'll see lots of these as we go up into the coast. But you have to understand that there are a variety of ways in which, and if you look for it in the communities and see whether you can see other ways in which the fish are produced. And this just shows some of the technologies that are used, and it goes back to that other sort of diagram that I showed you of the different ways in which farm fish take place. You still have by the way, in all of these, you still have the smolt, the juvenile salmon, being created or raised from roe on shore, and raised to the point that they can then be used in any one of these kinds of technologies. So that's another element to the industry that you have to think about in terms of employment. One of these, you can see emerging technology, is everything on shore, land-based. And of course, that obviously solves the problem of escapees. It's hard to think, unless you're thinking of Finding Nemo, it's hard to think of fish escaping from some of these pens and finding their way back into the water. You also have the second one here you can see, if you go down on the left-hand side, the third one down, is completely enclosed pens, but still in fjords, inshore fishery. And then you have those Salmar kind, the open offshore ones that are actually in high seas. So I put this up really just to show you that the aquaculture and farm fishing is now viewed internationally by global agencies like the UN Food and Agriculture Organization and others as blue food, or a solution to poverty and hunger in the future. And it's conveyed as a more sustainable way of meeting global protein needs than perhaps land-based animal protein. The UNFAO suggests that By 2032, they expect another 17% growth in farm fishing capacity production globally. At the same time, they expect that there's going to be no growth at all in the wild or captured. And it goes back to my point of saw that it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize when you look at that first diagram that that's probably going to take place, the way those two graphs, the blue and the brown were extending. So despite the fact that you're getting protests in many places, and I'll speak to the protests in just a moment, it's almost to a point now that it's too important to ignore, and it's too important to turn back, both for a food source and also because these can be done at very small scale for poverty alleviation in the global south. I should say in Norway, their goal, the government of Norway's goal, is to increase production from the current 1.5 million metric tons or so forth now, to about 5 million metric tons by 2050. So what are the challenges or the concerns about the Norwegian aquaculture industry? There are three main concerns I want to speak to, especially with these intensive large-scale companies. The first is the so-called escapees of the farm fish from the pens. And one of the concerns is interbreeding, because these may be specific breeds. In Norway, they actually don't allow genetically modified or genetically engineered fish in the pens, but you can still have different breeds, and you can still have fish being raised in a very different methods, etc. And so if they interbreed not only with other wild salmon, but with other fish species potentially in the water, that could create problems for the wild or captured fish industry. In fact, as recently as January 2025, there was storm damage to a pen in Akra in northern Norway that saw the escape of 15,000 salmon. And this image is from sea pens during a storm in February of 2024, and 14 salmon pens were damaged during the storm. The second main challenge, and this is sort of, once again, just a sort of an image that shows the many ways in which pollution or environmental damage potentially could take place with aquaculture. You can have pollution of the water ecosystems through the feed. So the feed doesn't stay in those pens, so it may affect species beyond the pens themselves. You have to ask yourself, well, what is happening with the fish feces that's produced? Is that affecting the seabed and the areas around that, and maybe even the shellfish that are there as well? And what about the wastewater that's produced, whether it's an on-land system or an inshore system? What's happening with the wastewater, and how does that affect the water supply nearby? And the other thing is eutrophication or oxygen depletion. So if you have a very intense, so many fish in one area, and although the water is filtering through, is it going to affect the amount of oxygen that other fish species or other water-based species need to survive? The third challenge are diseases. And this is the one that in a lot of veterinarian schools that have an aquatic division to them, this is the one that they worry about and they spend a lot of time and attention on. And especially sea lice at the larger scales in the sea pens. Now this is both a production and a cost problem, because Norway anticipates about 15% mortality in many of these pens. And that's actually not a bad rate compared to some countries that have fish farms. So it's a production or cost problem, but it's also a potentially infectious problem as well if there's escapees. So what often happens is that antibiotics are used to try to stop the lice from attaching or breeding on the salmon. And so the antibiotics, but the lice adapt to those antibiotics. And so you have to come up with a stronger antibiotic. And so it's almost like a cycle that happens. Each generation of lice adapts to that antibiotic, and they then come back with a vengeance. And you need stronger antibiotics. So once again, you can see if you have the release of these fish, that may actually, if the lice have adapted to those, that might even be more difficult to solve that problem when they attack wild or captured salmon. Now, Norway has incorporated almost like they call it a traffic light system to regulate the exposure of wild salmon to sea lice. And each year, the government, based on the extent of sea lice in wild salmon in the regions along the coast, there are 18 regions, they've divided into 18 regions along the coast. The aquaculture companies are permitted to either expand production, that's sort of the green light, to keep production unchanged, the yellow light, or to reduce production, the red light. And in 2024, 6 regions, you see mainly in the south here, or 6 regions mainly in the north, were given the green light, so they could expand production. 5 were given a yellow light, 5 regions were yellow light, and 2, mostly in the south, were given the red light. Norway is often considered almost the gold standard in terms of regulation and the regulatory system in the world. And when you compare regulation in Norway to other countries, compared, for example, to the European Union, Canada, and the United States, there are a lot of important contextual differences. So you can't just compare apples to apples here. Remember, Norway has lots of sheltered coastline and fjords, unlike Canada and the United States primarily, and even in the EU, there's not a lot of sheltered sheltered coastlines. The other thing that exists in Norway is there isn't a lot of major urban population centers along those coastlines in the north. There's a lot of the fishing communities, but there's not a large center. The population centers are down the south and the southeast. So that makes a difference perhaps even in terms of the perception of the problem, because you don't have a large population nearby a lot of these, the sea pens. So in fact, there's much less negative publicity, not negative perception of aquaculture in Norway than there is in many other countries. This image shows First Nations protesting farm fishing on the coastal waters of BC in Canada. And where it's still primarily wild or captured salmon industry. Most Norway stakeholders, including the environmentalists, the scientists, the government, and even the companies themselves, are actually agree on that the regulation is good and there's a good balance between environmental protection and the needs for the industry and development. The problems that appeared in Norway in the early stages, especially the escapees and the sea lice and the fish waste, largely that's been addressed. There's still lots of minor problems, I'll say, that have emerged, and then I've given you some examples. But if you asked many of the people in the Norway aquaculture industry, they're relatively happy compared to a lot of other places, especially in Europe. They feel that they've got predictable environmental guidelines, and they can therefore count on those in terms of the capital investment needed for some of those larger capital-intensive projects. So unlike the United States and Canada, and especially and elsewhere, a lot of the protests are linked to the issue of genetically engineered and genetically modified salmon. As I said, in Norway, there are no GE salmon that are allowed in open pens, but they're now considering allowing some gene editing. And I'm not a biogeneticist by any means, but when you look up the difference between genetically modified and gene editing, the one difference is that genetically modifying means that you can incorporate DNA from other species, even non-fish species, into the DNA of salmon. Whereas gene editing means you're still modifying the DNA, but you're modifying the DNA specific to that salmon. So you're changing the DNA, but keeping the salmon. You're not introducing DNA from other species here. So elsewhere in the European Union, there's a perception that the industry is over-regulated and it's less predictable. And Norway, as I said, has that reputation for and being environmentally responsible still, that balance between concern for the environment, being sustainable, and relatively low cost. I'm going to sort of end there and just say that So we'll see for ourselves the aquaculture industry as we go down it, and ask people, if you encounter them, how they feel about the industry in Norway. And as I showed, I think this is almost inevitable in terms of at a global level, given the need for animal protein or protein in general, and the proven uses of farm fishing in multiple ways in different places. And this is just a teaser from my next presentation. I'm going to get back to something that I spent 15 years doing before I retired, and that's in a program at a graduate level in island studies. And I wrote a textbook, an introduction to island studies. And so my next book, I'm back on stage here at 6:30 tomorrow night, and I'm going to talk about the 10 ways islands have changed the world. So thank you very much. I appreciate you coming. Thanks for tuning in on TV. And I'll be at the back there if you want to ask me any questions about it.